Well, good morning. I'm so glad that you're here today. For those of you who are with us live and those joining us online, I'm Pastor Vicki, and I am really glad that you're kicking this series off with us. We're going into 2023, and we want to do it fearlessly. That's the name of our new series. So I have a question for you as we begin. What would it take for you not to be afraid? What would it take for you not to be afraid? How much money would you have to have in the bank? You got a number? How much control would you have to have over your job? How many aches and pains could you have before you start thinking, oh, this is the slow march to death? This morning I was all kinked up, so he says, what'd you do? I said, I got out of bed. That was it. That's all it took. How many gray hairs could you have before you're like, oh, my manhood's gone, my womanhood's gone, now I'm just going to get older? How far could you travel before you started to get afraid? You're a little too far away from home. Or better yet, how far could your kids move away before you were afraid for them? How predictable would your future have to be for you to not be afraid? Because, we think that the way to not be afraid is to not get into any circumstances that we don't know what's going to happen. We think the way to not be afraid is to have control over everything that happens, nothing happen out of the ordinary, nothing happens out of what we expect, nothing bad happen, and then we won't be afraid. That's not how it works. There are people who don't have 2 nickels to rub together who are afraid, people who have $1 billion who are afraid. There's no amount of money that makes you unafraid. There's no amount of time, there's no amount of energy, there's no amount of circumstances that we can control that makes us unafraid. So if we want to have the year that God's intending for us to have, if we want to be the people that God's intending for us to be, we've got to figure out how to face 2023 unafraid. Why? Well, because fear doesn't share the heart very well. Fear insists that it is the dominant force when it's around. It is like the bully that graduates with you and goes home with you after graduation. Shows up at the hospital when you're having your kids and still steals your lunch money when you're 88 years old. Fear requires that it be the dominant thing. It is not going to share your heart with compassion or courage or faith or mercy or love. It does not share the human heart. So just thinking that our circumstances will somehow be okay and we will be unafraid, not going to happen. 0 chance of happening. And if we let it dominate us, we're not going to be the people God intended, but worse than that, our kids and our grandkids are going to see what we model for them. And that's going to be a dominant force in their life too. I read a statistic this week, absolutely couldn't fathom. The average child today has the same level of anxiety as a psychiatric patient of the 1950s. Let me say that again. The average child today has the same level of anxiety as a psychiatric patient in the 1950s. If we don't get a handle on fear, we are going to be miserable. And worse yet, we're going to make sure that our kids and grandkids are too. Now, fear is actually a good thing. It started out as a good thing. We have these glands called the amygdala, and it is, Dave Ramsey calls it the cheetah detector. Like we're gazelles, and you have to know when that cheetah's nearby. You ever have the hair on the back of your neck stand up? Yeah, that's your cheetah detector going off, right? That's your amygdala saying something's wrong. And what it does is it dumps adrenaline in your system so that you can flee or fight. And you have more strength to do so. It gives you kind of tunnel vision and makes you hyper-focused so you can deal with the threat at hand. God has designed our bodies this way. That's a good thing, except that our cheetah detector gets triggered now when it rains, when we get a bad grade, when we get a bill that we didn't expect, when we get a phone call. How did we get here? I don't understand. When I was a teenager, talking on the phone was a recreational sport. And now you have to text people to ask them permission to call them. Who made up these rules? The number one growing phobia in our country is talking on the telephone. Our cheetah detectors are going off when our phone rings. Folks, that is not the life that God intended for us to have. That is not where all this is supposed to be heading. Imagine your life without fear. Whatever flavor yours happens to be. So in this series, what we're going to do is we're going to deal with some of the major fears that we have. Because, again, life is not going to all of a sudden make itself predictable to the point that we'll never fear again. It's something we have to choose. It is something that not only do we choose, but because fear is that bully, because fear has to dominate the human heart when it's around, it doesn't just evaporate. It doesn't just go away. It needs to be replaced with something. It needs to be identified. If you're a redneck and you grew up redneck like me, you need to punch it in the nose. If you're woke, we need to show it compassion so it will leave quietly. Whichever one it is, it got to be dealt with. It's got to be replaced. So we're going to talk, instead of me just standing up here saying, don't be afraid, okay, go home. We're going to talk about how we can choose not to be afraid. How we can help our cheetah detector not to go off simply because it rains. We wake up, can't move, get a gray hair, don't have enough money in the bank. We're going to talk about how we do that. And we're going to use the 23rd Psalm in order to do that. Many of you have heard the 23rd Psalm. If you were raised in Sunday school, I'm sure that you have heard it read before. If I have the honor and privilege of doing your funeral, it will be spoken to your family. It is a great picture of the Lord's care for us, but also it's exactly the kind of thing that we need to replace that fear with faith. To give our minds something else to chew on other than what we're afraid of. Because again, that fear is not going to evaporate. We've got to give our minds, we've got to give our hearts something else to replace it with. And we're going to use this 23rd Psalm to help us do that. Now I wanted to start 23 off this way because what I've learned over the last 27 years of ministry is that there are two things that keep the Christian from being everything that God's intended for us to be, and that is unforgiveness and fear. So we're going to tackle that second one during our series talking about the most common fears and pervasive fears that we have. Today, we are going to talk about the fear of not having enough. The fear of running out. Fear is so powerful that it actually creates its own reality. We tend to end up with exactly what we're afraid of. I watched this happen at my husband's church, one of his churches. Don't worry, it's not about you guys, and they'll never see this. But they were planning this children's event. They were inviting the entire town to this event. They had the blow-up games and the face painting and all of these fun things they were going to do. Entire town invited. And then they were going to feed them. And they started talking about, oh, how much are we going to charge for this and that? And there was a gentleman at the planning meeting who said, no, we are not charging for this. And he took out his checkbook. For those of you who don't know, your debit card used to be on paper. And you used to have to write out how much you wanted to pay for things. So he took his checkbook out and he signed it, blank check, handed it to the person organizing it and said, you take this and you go buy whatever you need in order to feed those kids. So they decided on chicken nuggets, because what kid doesn't like chicken nuggets? So the day came, everybody's having a blast, and they walk in to get dinner, their parents are with them, and kid walks up this big, gets 3 chicken nuggets. Kid walks up this big, gets 3 chicken nuggets. Adult walks in this big, gets 3 chicken nuggets. Well, if you've ever met children, they can eat 3 chicken nuggets from the time they get from the serving table to their seat. Why is there just 3 chicken nuggets? We had a blank check. We could go buy as many as we needed. Well, the person who organized it, she did go, and she bought 6 or 7 huge bags of chicken nuggets. But then there was the kitchen lady. Now, all respect to Cindy Christopher, our kitchen lady. She would never do this, right? But there was this one, and she was afraid. She was afraid that some would go to waste if she made too many. So she only made 3 bags of chicken nuggets. Now, they were in the freezer. They could have gone out, they had a blank check, they could have made 10 bags of chicken nuggets. But she made 3 because she was afraid somebody might waste one. There might be a stray chicken nugget that got put into the trash. They created their own scarcity. They ran out, not because there wasn't more in the freezer and not because they couldn't have bought more at the store. They ran out because of their own fear. That's the power of fear. It creates its own reality. They had an abundance of chicken nuggets. And all the fun that everybody had, they walked out the doors going, what's the deal with the 3 chicken nuggets? They created their own scarcity. It was very foreseeable, very preventable, because they allowed their fear to create the scarcity they were afraid of. So how do we equip ourselves to make better choices, better decisions? How do we find a way to replace that fear with something else? Well, every Sunday during this series, we are going to say the 23rd Psalm together. We're going to give our brains and our hearts something else to focus on besides our fear. So I would like for us to say it today. I think we have a slide. I just want you to say it in unison with me. Maybe it's familiar, maybe it's the first time you've ever heard it. That's okay. I'm sure you, by the time we're done with this, you will probably have it memorized. Let's say it together. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He makes me to lie down in green pastures. He leads me beside still waters. He restores my soul. He leads me in paths of righteousness for his name's sake. Even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I fear no evil, for you are with me. Your rod and your staff, they comfort me. You prepare a table before me in the presence of my enemies. You anoint my head with oil. My cup overflows. Surely goodness and mercy will follow me all the days of my life, and I will dwell in the house of the Lord forever. Amen. We're not going to talk about this whole thing today. We're just going to talk about the first couple verses. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. What does that mean? We're not used to talking like that, are we? The Lord is my shepherd, I have everything I need. The Lord is my shepherd. I am content. He makes me to lie down in green pastures. I have no fear of running out. I have everything I need. Now, in order to research this message, I read a book called A Shepherd Looks at the 23rd Psalm. It was written back in the 70s by a sheep rancher. And he told a story about this one ewe that he had. He said, she was great. She was healthy and strong, and she always gave birth to really healthy babies. He said it was great, except twice I had to fish her out of the river because she had to have that extra little nibble that was right on the edge of where she could reach down the hill, and she would tumble down the hill and into the river, and twice I had to fish her out of there. And not only that, she was an escape artist. She could always figure out the place in the fence where she could wiggle through. We said that our property was against this river, so if the river was ever too dry, she could squeeze past and end up over at the other ranch. She said, now, the problem of it was, he says, I took very good care of my pastures. We put out salt and minerals and made sure that they irrigated and everything. I said, the guy next to me, not so much. He didn't tend to his lambs well. Said he didn't make good pastures for them. He said it was brown over there. And yet somehow she would figure out that she had to go check it out and make sure and get that last nibble of grass, somehow getting out past the fence. But said the worst part of it was she taught her lambs how to do that. So not only was I chasing her out of the neighbor's ranch land, I was then getting her kids out, and then she kept teaching some of the other ewes how to do that, and he said, finally I had to get rid of her. He said, because here she had all this lush green pasture behind her, but somehow that wasn't enough. Somehow she was afraid that there was more that she was going to miss out on. So she had to sneak over to the other side. So, in the midst of it all, she had plenty. And yet, somehow, she thought she was going to run out. The Lord is my shepherd. I have everything I need. He makes me to lie down in green pastures. So he went on to say that that's the thing about these sheep. They will not lie down when they're afraid. They have to be free from fear, and they have to not be hungry, or they are not lying down anywhere. So, he said, I don't know how many times they were just restless. And when they're restless, he said, even just a rabbit can make them go. Well, until I walked out. And when they heard my voice, it was amazing how they'd settle down. And then they'd get to lie down. If somebody could get me a cough drop, that would be marvelous. Gotta love it. So not only am I old, I'm also infirmed. Thank you. So, this will play well in the live feed. He makes me to lie down in green pastures. Remember, this was written 4,000 years ago in the Middle East. It was arid and dry. There were not green pastures unless you made them so. You were not going to stumble upon a green pasture where you could feed. That green pasture came because the shepherd made it so. They put out the salt, they put out the minerals, they irrigated the land, all so the sheep had a place to feed. You see, I think we get afraid that we're going to run out because we forget that it's the shepherd's job to provide the pasture. The green pastures exist because the shepherd made it so. No, I'm not saying that we don't work. I'm not saying that we don't try our best. But our restlessness and discontent, it's in our own heart and our own mind. Because our shepherd leads us in places where we have enough. That's his job. If we find ourselves restless, we're kind of like those sheep, like that ewe, standing in a lush pasture, looking at through the fence, going, man, maybe there's something better out there. Instead of turning around and going, I have everything I need. I have everything that I need. But we have to choose contentment. We have to realize we are never going to have enough money to not be afraid of running out. We are never going to have enough control. We are never going to have enough security to have no cause for fear. We have to choose something else. We have to choose contentment by reminding ourselves that it's the job of the shepherd to provide. And we have to trust. We have to occupy our heart and our mind with something else. I'm hoping that learning the 23rd Psalm together will help us do that. It'll give us something else to think about and replace that fear. Because the Bible tells us that it is perfect love that kicks out fear. That bully is going to get kicked out by one thing, and that's love. Perfect love casts out fear. There's a scripture in the story in the Gospels about Jesus. He's in a boat, and they're crossing the Sea of Galilee, and he's with his disciples, and this storm comes up. And they're afraid they're going to drown. And Jesus is asleep in the boat. And they're like, wait, I need you to wake up because we're going to drown. Jesus wakes up. He's experiencing exactly the same thing they are. They are literally in the same boat. Them afraid, and him calm enough, content enough to take a nap. And he wakes up and he calms the storm and he says, where's your faith? You see, he had faith in the perfect love of God. For him, for them. Because perfect love casts out fear. We don't have to be afraid. It reminds me of when I was first married. You see, I grew up in Flatland. That's where all my redneck ancestors are. And when you're in Flatland, you have to worry about tornadoes because they travel a whole lot faster and further on Flatland. So we had this thing called a weather radio. And you always had to listen to that, and there were alarms and alerts and everything from it. And whenever there was a tornado watch or a tornado warning, Dad would start his ritual of listening to the weather radio and then walking outside and taking a look to see what the sky looked like and if he could see any funnel clouds. So we get married, and my husband, who's a wonderful man, but he did not grow up in Flatland. And so the tornado watch warning comes around, and he's like, well, honey, I'm going to bed. You're what? You don't have a weather radio? Nope. I said, I'll get us one of those. That's fine. I said, you're not going to go outside and look for funnel clouds? Nope, I'm going to bed. Well, what happens if one comes? He goes, well, then I will die and go to heaven and see Jesus. I don't get the downside. I'll remind you, we had just gotten married. That might have had something to do with it too. I don't know. But wait a minute. And he's like, what's the worst that can happen? And here's Jesus. He goes, what's the worst that can happen? We are loved perfectly by our Father. We are loved perfectly by the shepherd. We are loved perfectly. We can have faith in that. Where's your faith in our shepherd? You see, that bully fear is going to get kicked out by faith in the perfect love of the shepherd. We are perfectly loved, perfectly cared for. That is what will kick out the fear. So if this is one of the things that you struggle with, which a lot of us do, I'm preaching to myself today, so you're allowed to listen in, but this is all for me. This is one of my big fears that I've had to wrestle with my entire life. In the process of it, if you are always looking through your financial statements and your retirement to see if there's going to be enough, or you have food in your freezer that you froze from 1979, because, you just might run out. If you're always looking for the gray hair in the mirror, wondering if this is the beginning of the end, there's an image that Psalm 23 gives us that I want to leave you with today. It's down toward the end of the psalm. It doesn't sound like much to us, but it would have meant a lot to the audience that was reading it for the first time, singing it in the church. It said, "My cup overflows. My cup overflows." You see, in their culture, they existed, they lived, they traveled by people taking you into their home. There were no hotels to go get to be able to survive out in the wilderness. You had to be taken in by relatives, strangers. You had to be shown hospitality in order to be able to exist in the world. So it was customary that they wouldn't even ask you what you were doing there for 3 days. Can you imagine having company for 3 days before it was polite to say, what you doing here? I don't know any friends or family members that I want to spend more than 3 days with at my house. 3 days before you could even ask what they wanted. Another few before you got around to going, man, these guests are like fish, they're starting to stink. So they developed in their culture this sign that it's time for you to move on. It was their way of saying, you don't have to go home, but you can't stay here. And that was when they filled up your wine glass. The first few days when you came, they would fill it and they'd let it overflow onto the plate below it. That meant we have plenty. There's enough to go around. But as you can imagine, after a few days, especially depending on how big the visiting party was, you might be getting a little skimpy on the pantry. Maybe not quite enough to go around anymore, running out of wine. So when you filled the goblet up, you'd only fill it part way. And that was the sign to your guests that it was time to move on. What does David say when he wrote this psalm? He said, "The Lord is my shepherd. I have everything I need. He makes me to lie down in green pastures of his own making. My cup overflows." There is plenty. There is an abundance. There are more than enough chicken nuggets to feed every little kid in town, with plenty to spare. My cup overflows. So when you start to worry about whether or not something, your time, your energy, your passion, your money, your health is going to run out, the Lord is my shepherd. I have everything I need. My cup overflows. My cup overflows. Now, I don't suggest you do this with the wine. That stuff can be expensive. But maybe when you're filling your water glass, just let it overflow. Just feel what it means to go, there's enough. There's plenty. I don't have to be afraid of running out. I can be content in what has been provided for me. The green pastures aren't determined by the economy. They're not determined by those things that we look to save us. It is the good shepherd who provides for me. He loves me perfectly, and that casts out my fear. I don't want to just say, don't be afraid, now go home. But I want to tell you about one particular time when I watched this happen. I got a gazillion of these, but just this one I'll share. Many years ago, my husband was diagnosed with cancer, and he went through a brutal year of being treated for it. Radiation, chemotherapy, surgery. The healing from it was years that it took. As a result, we had lots of medical bills, we had debt from it, we needed to move, all of those things. I ended up taking about 8 months off so that he could get settled into his new place. Gonna get another job. That's great, we got a place for you. Oh, no, that fell through. You'll be making $50 a week. Did I mention all these? So finally, we get put into 2 full-time churches, appointments. But it has taken its toll. And I'm like, man, we really need about $15,000 more than we have to make this work. So I don't know what else to do. I'm just going to pray. Say, God, you know what we need? I don't know how you're going to do it, but would you relieve this burden from us so we can lie down, so we can rest? About a month later, get an envelope in the mail. Your last accountants didn't do your taxes correctly for 2 years in a row. We were looking back through them, and you get a $4,000 refund. A couple months later, we had an expense that we were going to have, and we ended up getting a savings on it that we didn't expect. And midway through the year, which never happens, Ken gets a raise at his church. December 31st of that year, we had between the refund, the savings, and the raise, $14,000 come to us. Unexpectedly, not knowing how it was going to happen, not of our own doing. That is our Good Shepherd providing for us. That is what God can do when we simply say, this one's up to you. He stands up in the middle of our storm and said, peace, be still. I am with you. Have faith that you are loved perfectly.